Adventures in Mortuary Archaeology and Commemoration. It's Archaeodeath.
Archaeodeathlings, it's Archaeology Professor Howard Williams here, and I think it's fair to say that the production King and Conqueror has received a lot of criticism. Yes, this 8-part series that explores the events, quasi-historical in nature, leading up in the drama to the Battle of Hastings and the coronation of William I, the Conqueror, is a moment in the, to put it mildly, in the televisual representation of the early Middle Ages, and first time in a generation that we've got an opportunity to represent the material culture, architectures, monuments and landscapes of the 11th century for popular audiences. And so it was, I think it was important that I take this as an opportunity to reflect on the relationship of this 11th century to our modern age, when political discourse is constantly obsessed with our Anglo-Saxon origins and our deep time relationship and anxieties surrounding invasions across the Channel and our relationship between the Saxons and the Normans. It seemed important that I comment, as someone who does public engagement and education on the archaeology and heritage of death and memory and the early Middle Ages as well. And these coalesce in this TV production. And while there's been a lot of criticism, I thought it was generally okay and vaguely interesting, but of course it strayed in many ways from any historical realities, and in many ways that's fine. It's a bit of entertainment, but in other ways it does have misleading and aspects to it that I think are important. For me, one of the most interesting though is the choice of funeral for one of the lead characters, and their choice of how they represent it. And I think this very much shows less anything to do with trying to represent the 11th century and more to do with the drama and spectacle that funerals now occupy in the storylines of both fantasy television and film and also historical dramas. So from Game of Thrones to Vikings, cremation on open air pyres has dominated our popular understanding of heroic, legendary and historical funerals, and that is represented in the show in the funeral of Earl Tostig, the brother of Harold Godwinson, who dies at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and we see a choice to cremate him. So there are a number of interesting elements to the choices made in representing this high status Christian Anglo-Saxon cremation. The first point I suppose to make is that there is in no way any historical or archaeological evidence to support that anyone as late as the 11th century was regularly burning their dead in a sanctioned ceremonial way in this period, and this is therefore a utterly fictional, almost fantastical representation, and the circumstances are interesting and the details worth mentioning. So what we're shown, I'll go through what we see and then I'll pull it apart. We see a sort of, I thought it was leather, but actually it looks on closer inspection to be a felt material that seems to be in a medium brown sort of shroud and a separate head covering, so you can see who it is but they're not fully concealed, as a way of honouring the dead. In the background you get a hint of flowers and other objects of care and reverence shown to the dead person. So this is intended to be for respect and honour, because even though Harold the Godwinson accidentally slays his brother at Stamford Bridge and they were on opposing sides, there is a hint that their bonds are not fully disaggregated, that they still love each other, and there's sorrow for this death. So this isn't a celebratory death or a triumphant victory. This is to honour a rival, but someone still much loved by the lead characters. So it's a mournful, sorrowful, tragic death as portrayed. And cremation therefore embodies that sense of spiritual release, of transformation and commemoration and sorrow, and the care shown in wrapping the body and affording flowers to the body convey that to audiences very clearly. The scene, though, fits a trope of television cremation and filmic fantasy and historical cremation, in that it's not with big crowds. It's in an isolated setting, like Jon Snow in Ygritte. It is in a isolated location where the king himself is the lone mourner, bar 2 guards and his loyal retainer Thane Thomas. So it's very much, you don't get to see who builds the pyre. There's no public mourning, there's no wailing, there's no other funerary activities, no procession. It is just a body isolated, placed on top of a pyre, supine and extended in this shroud. But material culture is shown to be really important here, because we see that Harold has retrieved from the body of Earl Tostig a fragment of the shield that Harold had given his brother. Now, that shield was supposed to be significant, whether it's nothing to do with historical reality, of course, but the idea is that this was a replica of the shield with the appliques that are supposed to mimic that of King Alfred the Great, who is seen as the West Saxon progenitor, ancestor. Whether he's actually the ancestor of Harold Godwinson Tostig is another matter, but they are portraying that in the film, that Alfred the Great's legacy is to be remembered and honoured. And so Harold had given his brother a replica shield, and we see he prized that shield until Harold Hardrada deliberately breaks it and gives him a new Norwegian Viking shield to sort of supplant his identity. But Tostig can't leave it alone and picks up a piece of the applique that has a serpent biting its own tail, which is supposed to represent the House of Wessex. So you've got this idea that this memento, the broken bit of his shield, symbolises his loyalty. Well, he's completely disloyal in terms of taking the side of Harold Hardrada, but it articulates that continued bond of love and affection and loyalty between Harold and his brother, despite the tragedy and the circumstances of their conflict. So this is all historically preposterous in terms of 11th century open air cremation for an elite individual, for Earl Tostig to be cremated in this way on a headland overlooking the sea. They'd have to have transported his body at least 28 miles to Barmston, south of Bridlington, to cremate him from Stamford Bridge. So none of this makes practical geographical sense. There's no evidence this would have taken place. The idea that an elite death in a battle could afford exceptional disposal methods does give you a window for trying to reach for an explanation and justification, but really this is in the realms of fantasy. But what's really interesting is the choice of cremation as a public spectacle, and the choice to give an object that is a memento kept by Tostig of his love for his brother and his ancestors. It does seem to be significant. Next we have the second gesture. The first gesture is the placing of this fragmentary memento of their former relationship, broken by Hardrada but sort of restored through honouring Tostig in this mournful, private but spectacular funeral. And the second gesture is the lighting of the pyre by himself. So Thane Thomas hands Harold a torch, and he then he lights the pyre. And this is a really striking scene. You can see the sun is supposedly setting, although that is rather confusing in terms of the geography of where this is supposed to be on the east coast, but let's not worry about that. And you see this pyre. The construction of the pyre isn't made visible. One can presume there are horizontal logs laid in a lattice, but that's not clear because of the vertical sticks put around it. But you see his head is now enclosed, and you see vegetation around the edges, and he lights the pyre and steps back, and you see the blaze erupt, and he hands the torch back to Thane Thomas, and they watch as the fire gathers pace and his body burns. So there is a sense of respect and tragedy. No singing, no songs, no wailing, no dancing, just sombre cremation. Now, As I said, there's no evidence of cremation taking place in 11th century England. The last cremation flurry is very minor and associated with Scandinavians in the Viking Great Army, and at Heathwood Ingleby Cemetery have cremation mounds near where the Great Army had overwintered in 873 to 74. So evidence that some Scandinavians stayed around for at least a generation, perhaps retaining their heathen ways and cremating in a fashion that resembled southern Scandinavia. But whatever the interpretation of Heathwood Ingleby, that was a cemetery that was almost 150 years plus since it had been abandoned. There's no evidence that anyone was cremating their dead in 11th century England, beyond perhaps revenants, digging up corpses that wouldn't rest easy and who were cursing the living. But beyond that, cremation was not the standard practice. So beyond the possibility that there was some way we can justify this as, well, this is supposed to be aberrant because he was someone who turned his back on his kingdom, was killed as a traitor, and yet Harold is still honouring him, it's a stretch. Then they look up in the sky and perceive Halley's Comet, even though Halley's Comet was most likely visible in the skies of northern Europe in the spring of 1066. Now they notice it, and it's a bad omen in September, late September 1066. And this is a striking moment, whether it's historically accurate or not, and it's not, because it allows us to have a pan back shot showing us a small cart, 3 soldiers standing guard, and Thane Thomas and Harold Godwinson watching the pyre burn. So a dramatic scene reflected off the water there. It's almost implied that the reflections of the light in the sky and the light of the pyre sort of connect each other, and whether, taking aside the historical accuracy, one has to concede that this is a very sombre and yet striking scene of celestial smoke rising, the comet, and then the light of the still waters. I just think this is brilliant, if ludicrous. So what do we make of this? So this is best understood in the tradition of filmic and televisual fantasy and historical cremations on an open pyre. It's not really explained or comprehensible. It's historically inaccurate, but in the history of cinema and television, it fits into the correct sort of tempo, aura and spectacle one would expect for honouring a tragic death, in which there is no post-cremation ceremony. It's the act of burning alone that is a farewell and a spiritual release for the corpse, and the cessation of that relationship. So it fits into our expectations for cremation and has nothing to do with early medieval cremation practices. And I suppose this is complementary to the death of Harold himself, in which we have a parallel journey conducted, of showing a memento of ancestry and lineage, and a burial, not necessarily a cremation, that serves as the enduring testament of this ruler. Not afforded a grand tomb as the defeated, but still a respectful burial. And we'll get onto that in another video.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.